So thank you so much, everyone, for coming to the Environmental Justice Practitioners Network. I am Allie Tharp with the UU Ministry for Earth, and I am so thankful to Dina Gilio-Whitaker, a author, scholar, journalist, for coming to be with us tonight and share some wisdom about her new book, As the Grass Grows, an Indigenous History Struggle for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock. So welcome, Dina. Thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Why, Ali, that's actually not a question, that's a statement. Why Pisnaxiel ku isquis Dina Gilio-Whitaker? Ismakalak Naspuus, and that is a greeting in my Indigenous Insukchin language. I'm a member of the Colville Confederated Tribes of Washington State, and I would also like to do a quick land acknowledgement, which is about acknowledging that I'm on the traditional territory of the Ahashiman people here in Orange County in Southern California. So is the sound okay? Okay, because I was getting a little bit of an echo, but that seems to be better now. Okay. Okay, so let's see, where can I start? I guess what I would like to start is by asking how many people have read the book yet, this being the book. I guess people are muted, so, and I can't see everybody, but that's okay. That's okay. Bill has read it. Okay, okay, good. There may be others. Okay, so I think what I'll do is I will kind of start from the beginning about how this book came to be. And it starts with, I'm going to try keeping track of my time here too. So it started when I was in grad school. This is a project that goes back at least 10 years. So the book represents at least 10 years of research and writing and scholarship and thinking, you know, years of thinking about this topic, even beginning when I was an undergrad. So I was in grad school in probably about 2009, and I was looking for a master's thesis project. And I was living in New Mexico at the time, and I was getting ready to move to Southern California, here in Orange County, where I'm living now. And so I needed this project. And I came across a story that I did not know about at the time. And I write about this in the book in the chapter on sacred sites. So when you read the book, you'll recognize the story. And so it was about something that happened here that was a battle to protect a native sacred site of the Ahashiman people. And the name of this place is called Panhe. And Panhe is a archaeological site that's known to be at least 9,600 years old. So it's it's an old ancient village site that was one of probably the center of Ahashiman culture for thousands and thousands of years. And so, the site was threatened because a private toll road was going to come through and build right next to what is still a burial site. Now, this site, Panhe, is a very large site. At one time, you know, before it was invaded and colonized, it was a very large site, and it's very close to the water. It's very close to the beach, and so this toll road, but it's in this place that is this really complex tangle of jurisdictions, because it's now property that's owned by the Department of the Navy and is organized as Camp Pendleton, which is a Marine base. At the same time, this particular piece of land is also leased out to the California State Park System and is a state park, San Onofre State Park. So and this particular piece of it is a campground. Okay, so this sacred site, this ancient village site, is in a campground that's a state park that's within a military base, and it happens to be right next to a major nuclear plant. Okay, and it's right next to a beach that's called Trestles. That's one of the most important surf sites in the state of California and the world, okay, for surfing. San Clemente, which is the town where all this is pretty much the capital of the surf industry in California. And so this place, that's the surf beach called Trestles, is it's like a world treasure, like a World Heritage surfing site. And so this toll road was going to come by. It's going to be built basically on top of this burial site, and at the same time, it's a very sensitive ecological habitat with known endangered species. It's said to be the last remaining pristine watershed in Southern California, and the building of this toll road through this site would undoubtedly have disrupted the site so much, this creek bed, because this creek bed runs through there. It's a watershed, the San Mateo Creek watershed. The watershed, the creek bed of this creek would have been so disrupted that it would have sent all this sediment and silt downstream, where it empties out right next to Trestles, the surf site, which would have probably ruined the wave quality. Trestles is known for its perfect wave quality, and the building of this toll road would have ruined it, probably, according to the environmental assessment impact result, or study. So so you had the environmental movement led by the Sierra Club fighting this thing, and this had been going on for years. And then you had the surfers. Once they heard about what the potential impact to the surf site, they got on board to fight this thing. And then the native community came. They were actually relatively last to this fight. And so what happened was that they built coalitions with a bunch of other stakeholders in the surf community and the environmental community to stop this toll road, and this thing went on for years. Well, finally, it was the California Coastal Commission in protecting or in enforcing the California Coastal Act. The Coastal Commission was in charge of issuing the final permits. So what happens is the Coastal Commission denies the permit for the road based on quite a few criteria that they felt this road would have violated. And one of those criteria was the fact that this is a major known Native American sacred site. And so it was a huge win for everybody involved. But what happened was that it was celebrated in the media as a major victory based on the environmental issues and the saving of this surf spot, Trestles. Far less attention was paid to the aspect of it being a sacred site, a native sacred site. And so I was fascinated by all of this, and I decided to write this master's thesis looking at what were the narratives that were at play in this battle. How did all of these people relate to each other? What were the things that were being said and not being said in the end around this victory? So I wrote the thesis, and it was very well received by my professors, and I get out of grad school. I decide not to pursue a PhD. That's another story, but I decided not to do that. I get out of school with my master's. I move to San Clemente, and I go right into a research job at an organization called the Center for World Indigenous Studies, and I went back into a journalism career. So I'm spending all these years just researching and writing, and I'm focusing a lot on environmental issues. And so so I get with Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, who is the author of the opening reading that Ali did. And her and I write this book together. All the real Indians died off, and 20 other myths about Native Americans. So we write that book together, and the book comes out. And right when the book comes out, it's when Standing Rock is happening. And so this major standoff, this major protest movement is happening at Standing Rock. And our book, Roxanne and I are like on a book tour. We went all over the country. For 2 months, we were traveling, giving book talks right when Standing Rock was happening and all these incredible human rights abuses were happening. And so it was really present in people's minds, and people wanted to talk about it. And it was right at that time that our editors at Beacon Press had asked me if, they were curious about what environmental justice looks like for Native people. And they asked me if I'd be interested in writing the book. And I said, yes, of course I would be, because I've been thinking about this for a really long time and writing about it. So that's kind of the backstory of how this book came to be. It's really tied up in not just my identity as a Native person, but also me being a Native person living in the particular area where I live in Southern California, in coastal Southern California. Because coastal Southern California is one of the most difficult places for Native people to have their sites protected. And that was one of the interesting things about the Panhe story. It's a horrible problem that the tribal people in California, all of coastal California, deal with. Their sacred sites are disappearing at a rate of 10 per day, which sounds crazy. But that's what I've been told by a professional cultural monitor. Over 90% of the sacred sites, of Native sacred sites in coastal Southern California, are known to be gone. So it's fighting the relentless battles of development here, where there are very few, very strong laws to protect that from happening, especially for the unfederally recognized tribes like the Ahashiman people, because they are not a federally recognized tribe. That's one of the hugely complicating factors for them in this story. So I went to Standing Rock. I wasn't there for very long. I went for a few days, and I was there at the time that pretty much everybody else went there, that Thanksgiving weekend. It was really, really crowded. And I went as a journalist working with Indian Country Today Media Network and working on a couple of different stories. And so, but I was only there for a few days, but I was there long enough to get a feel for what was happening on the ground. And so when my editors at Beacon Press had asked me to write this book, it was using Standing Rock as sort of a grounding example that was the most obvious place to start from, because people were curious about it. It had finally gotten some pretty wide attention, and it was the perfect example of what environmental injustice in Indian country looks like, because of the treaty violations, because of the human rights violations, because of this concept of environmental racism. Okay, so now I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about, what what is environmental injustice as I write about it in the book, and what is environmental justice on the other hand, right? Injustice versus justice. So, so the case that I make in the book is that environmental justice needs to be indigenized. And what I mean by that is that environmental justice as a multi-layered topic that involves policy, it involves law, it involves discourse, it's theory, and praxis and activism. It's all these things, right? So when we use this broad term called environmental justice, it means a bunch of different kinds of things. And it involves different kinds of communities. And not all of those communities even actually talk to each other. This is one of the kind of difficult things that I see as somebody who is a scholar and a journalist, an activist, and you know, bridging some of those communities. I'm still looking for ways to make those kinds of connections to each other, because it seems odd, and it is odd that not all these things communicate with, or these kinds of communities communicate with each other about these ideas. So so anyway, indigenizing environmental justice means that we need to not look at it through the same lens that all other environmental justice communities are seen through, okay? And that lens really comes down to this definition of environmental justice hinging on the concept of environmental racism. So that comes back to the way environmental justice is defined in law and policy. And the foundation of that is this idea that racism is the culprit for the disproportionate siting of noxious facilities like toxic waste dumps and a wide array of processes that disproportionately affect communities of color and poor communities. So, and that goes back to the beginning of environmental justice discourse, as a field of study, as a academic discipline, even we could say. And then it goes back to the early 1980s and the activism around that in the Deep South, okay? So in the South, Black communities were being targeted for toxic waste facilities, and they suspected that they were being targeted because they were people of color. Well, after several years of community-based studies, the results of those studies did show evidence that they were right, that they were being targeted. And so years of these results of looking at it through this lens does produce evidence that they were right. And so it results in action taken at the federal level. By 1990, 91, 92, President Clinton issues Executive Order 12898 that defines environmental justice. Let's see, I don't have that language in front of me. But it basically, Allie, can you pull up that PowerPoint? So I can get exactly that language, and let me look at it on my end too. Let me see if I can find it. I don't know if I have it in this. Oh, I don't think I have it in this one. With the definition of it. What?
It's Executive Order 12898.
Oh, there it is. Okay, yeah. Yes, so the definition of environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Okay, that sounds fine on the surface, but what it does is that it conflates all people of color into one category of people. And the problem with that is that it doesn't, it reduces American Indian people to one of these ethnic groups. But American Indians are not just an ethnic group. American Indians are nations with political relationships to the state and a very different relationship to land because of their ancient land tenure of being on the land for thousands of years. So my argument is that looking at the concept of environmental justice through this mode that collapses Native Americans into this one broad sweeping kind of category of people is really, it's going to fail them. It's not going to recognize their very different cultural and political circumstances. So that's kind of the starting point. And I look at, I'm looking in the book right now to kind of remind myself what my book is about. So I start out by talking about Standing Rock and what, why Standing Rock is such a perfect example of environmental injustice against American Indians. And then I look at the first chapter. The first chapter breaks down why environmental justice theory is not, as it's, conventionally conceived, is limited for Native people. And my argument is that and I follow the scholarship of somebody named Kyle White on this, where we look at settler colonialism as a process of environmental injustice. So, in other words, for Native peoples, the entire structure of settler colonialism as an ongoing structural process is environmental injustice. So if we look at it that way, if we look at it that way, then we have to look, if we look at the history of settler colonialism as an environmental history, it sheds a different light. And we can understand other processes as constituting environmental injustice, such as genocide. So we can talk about various aspects of genocide, including 400 years of indigenous slavery, right, which is very well documented, as part and parcel of the this not only history as in the past, something that has happened to Native people, but that still has ramifications today. And we also have to look at the structure of federal Indian law and the way federal Indian law keeps Native people in a relationship of subjugation and domination, this hegemonic relationship. So settler colonialism, settler societies as societies that inscribe themselves on top of indigenous communities is this ongoing, never-ending process of environmental injustice for Native people. And so that's where I'm coming from with this. And one of the main arguments that I make is that for Native people, the violation of sacred sites is a huge aspect of environmental injustice. These battles to protect Native sacred sites have been fought as religious battles, and they by and large fail because that the Western court system, a Eurocentric American legal system, is incapable of recognizing the very different epistemologies, which just means worldview, the very different kinds of worldviews that Native people have toward land. Western courts can't recognize that. They don't recognize the very different kinds of religious frameworks that Native people have toward their worlds and how land factors into that. It's encoded in federal Indian law through some very damaging Supreme Court cases, which makes it next to impossible for Native people to win sacred site battles as religious freedom issues. So my argument is that sacred site battles are fundamentally, or should be fundamentally, fought as environmental justice. Now, this is a paradigm shift. Some of these ideas that I'm talking about are very, they're pretty big ideas. Nobody's really written a book like this before. In fact, the literature on environmental injustice relative to American Indians is small to the point of being almost non-existent. So nobody's, I mean, you know, there are journal articles, there are a few books that talk about kind of different aspects of environmental injustice with case studies and things like that. But nobody's really like put forth a different way of looking at it, where we should be talking about it for the sake of policy and law in these different ways, and acknowledging the ways that it's not working for Native people in the legal system and in the policy framework as it exists now at the federal and state levels. So it's bold. It's something that, you know, hopefully it will be taken as a starting place to start having different conversations about what environmental justice means and doesn't mean for Native people. What I'm hoping to do with this conversation, with this book, is to make a different conversation so that we can be honest about these ideas, about the way environmental justice is talked about and the ways that the legal system dramatically falls short for Native people. And so at the end of the book, one of the things that I do is I look at the history of resistance, of Native people's resistance to these land incursions, these environmental incursions into historically and as they play out even today. And one of the things that I do is I take a really critical look at the environmental movement, because if we look at the history of the environmental movement in this country, it begins in land dispossession. If we take it back to the beginning of the national part, the conservation movement, okay, and the beginning of the state parks, the state park system in this country, which begins in 1872. It's a period of time where Native people are being brutally and aggressively dispossessed of their lands and forcibly removed from their lands. That's how the first state park that we have is Yellowstone. That's how Yellowstone is created. It's about creating wilderness, right? So the concept of protecting wilderness, like conserving wilderness, first has to be created, right? There were not empty wilderness spaces. when Europeans came here, every inch of this continent was occupied by native people in various kinds of ways. Many of them were migratory people, and I say migratory, not nomadic, because that's an incorrect way of understanding it. But they were people who lived based on what we call the seasonal round. The seasonal round is a way of using land that native people engaged in based on various food sources. So they would have their wintering grounds and they had their summering grounds, and it was all based on the availability of certain kinds of foods. So the beginning of the environmental movement is rooted in this active dispossession of native people from their lands, and it builds from there, and so it's based on the concept of indigenous inferiority. It's about native people not being deserving of their lands, of not being capable of taking care of their lands, of not being not having the divine right in the same way that Euro Americans did, right? Because it also comes out of this theory of manifest destiny, right? This divine right to inherit these lands. Native people were not entitled to that. And so the environmental movement is rooted fundamentally in these really problematic worldviews. And so I deconstruct that in this book, and it involves looking at the ways that the environmental movement has worked against Indian country systematically for a really long time, and so we see that shift, and I talk about that in the book too. We see it shift, but not until like the late 1990s does this relationship start to change for the better. But it's still pretty problematic in a lot of ways, and I look at that with the way that it played out at Standing Rock, between the native people and the non-native people in this native cultural sovereign space, and it happens in this very gendered way, this gendered sort of clash of worldviews, and that leads into talking about how Native women are. There's a whole chapter on how Native women have, for decades, been at the center of these Native resistance movements that are particularly rooted in the protection of the environment. So all of these things are tied together in these really intricate ways, and I think that chapter on women is really particularly important because a lot of modern Native history is written from these very male-centric perspectives. When we look at the resistance, like the Red Power movement during the 1960s, that leads into this new era of Indian self-determination, greater tribal power. It's really narrated with men at the center of it, but women were in some ways more at the center of those movements than the men were, and so finally these histories are beginning to be told, from sort of an indigenous feminist perspective, and that's kind of the take that the place that I take with it. So lots of unpacking there, lots of big ideas. In the final chapter of the book, what I do is I look at ways that these coalitions, these alliances are forming between native and non-native people that are producing results. And it's based on this realization that we're all sort of in this fight together now. We're all fighting climate change. We're all fighting big oil. We are fighting a deeply entrenched power structure that is built on corporate fossil fuel extraction, and so we have to fight together. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. We have to fight together, and Native people provide there's a roadmap in a way that that can be followed. Native people and especially with their particular kinds of knowledge, is this indigenous knowledge, the ways of living with the earth, provide leadership for this, for how we can all develop a much more sane relationship to the earth, one that will ensure our survival, because as we all know, it's our survival that's at stake now. It's not the earth that's dying. I don't subscribe to that belief. I think the earth will be fine. The earth will take care of herself in whatever ways that she needs to, but it may be, and it looks like it's our own ability, our own habitats, our own ability to survive that is being compromised. And so, we have to get back into balance. I mean, that's what Native peoples did. They lived in balance with their natural world, and that's what indigenous knowledge is. And so that's what really the world needs. And more and more people are beginning to say that. Even Western science is beginning to finally acknowledge that and embrace it, that indigenous knowledge, not just here in North America, but all over the world, indigenous peoples still live in the most biodiverse regions in the world. And it's those regions that are the healthiest. And so cultural diversity and biodiversity go hand in hand. And so science, Western scientists are finally catching on. So it's accepting this, acknowledging it, and hopefully, coming to some greater degree of political respect for Native people that will be our way out, if there is a way out. So I think I'm going to stop blabbing now and droning on and on and on. That was a lot of information to drop on you, and maybe now we can kind of open it up to questions, conversation.
Sure. Clyde, would you mind sharing what you wrote in the chat and starting a conversation with that? I just unmuted you, Clyde, so start over.
I'm Cherokee, so I come from the Eastern Woodlands peoples, my experiences with that conquest. The arguments the Europeans used when they first arrived is that the indigenous people never improved the land. They said that the land wasn't improved. Now, that for the Europeans, that meant fences and they'd plowing up the land and cutting it and tearing down the trees. But the reality was that the woods were all cleared, all from underbrush and fashioned into deer parks, and the berry bushes and garden plots were there. I mean, but they were ignored because, in a lot of ways, because what you said, Gina, Dina, that was what the women did the gardening, they did the berries, and because what they saw the men do was hunt. So that's what the men are hunters. course, the men were building the roads, bridges, clearing the underbrush, and all that stuff in addition to fishing and hunting. So they saw that basically they see the indigenous people not improving the land, and that they improved the land and therefore they owned it.
Yeah, that's true. And we know now that the landscape that the Europeans came into was what we call a cultural landscape, right? And the same is true here, and I talk about this quite a bit in the book. In California, the same was true. Now, in California, the tribal people they weren't agriculturalists in the same ways that they were in the East Coast. On the Eastern Seaboard, there were, people were farmers. They had huge farms. All over the South, they were farmers. In the Southwest, they were farmers. Most Native people were farmers in one form or another. But in California, they didn't farm in the same way. They didn't need to. They lived in a landscape that was so abundant with life and, with plant life and animal life. But what they did do is they managed their landscapes in ways that kept the earth fertile, right, and kept it really, really productive for what they needed it for. So they were horticulturists in ways that the Europeans didn't recognize, in the same way that they didn't recognize the way that they were landscape managers in the East. So, and the same is true in the Pacific Northwest. The Native people there, the land was so fertile and so abundant, they didn't need to farm, right? So they were managers in a way that, like, it's interesting to read about some of the early accounts of Yosemite, for example. No white man had ever seen Yosemite until 1851. Think about how late that is. And when they came into Yosemite Valley, they described something similar to what you just said about this, finely managed park, like a park-like environment. It looked like there had been orchards. It was a manicured landscape, and within just a few decades of Europeans sort of taking over that land, and this way of managing the land where they just let it go free, like they believe in non-intervention, which includes no controlled burning. This is one of the things that the natives in California were famous for. In fact, all over the country, but especially in California, they were famous for controlled burns, because they understood that if you let forests go wild, it produces the condition for these super fueled wildfires. So they prevented that. And so that's how the National Park Service starts, through this kind of not intervening on the land, and they stop these controlled burns. And within a few decades, the Indians go into the Yosemite Valley, and they don't even recognize it. They think it's messy and dirty, and they say that in some of these firsthand ethnographic accounts. Like they're just letting it go wild. They're not managing the land right. And isn't it interesting that now, a century later, we have here in California these radically out of control wildfires that is directly attributable to this mismanagement, really, of the forests. In some ways, Donald Trump was right. I mean, I hate to say it, he came out and said he's going to withhold money because you people out there in California aren't managing the forest correctly. He's sort of right, but not for the same reasons that I'm saying. But isn't it strange?
Like, controlled burns require human beings to control them. You can't do that by automation.
Yeah.
So Dina, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and we'll continue the conversation. But I want to say for those watching later, thank you so very much for sharing about your book. And I hope this inspires more folks to go ahead and buy a copy from Beacon Press. So thank you very much.